want to welcome and welcome back Dr. Michelle Miller. Dr. Miller serves as a professor of psychological sciences and President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Miller's academic background is in cognitive psychology, and her research interests include memory, attention, and student success in early college career. Dr. Miller co-created the First Year Learning Initiative at Northern Arizona University and is an active in course redesign, serving as a redesign scholar for the National Center for Academic Transformation. She's the author of Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, published by Harvard Press in 2014, and has written about evidence-based pedagogy and scholarly as well as general interest publications, including College Teaching Change, the Magazine of Higher Learning, and The Conversation. Dr. Miller's current work focuses on using psychological principles to help instructors create more effective and engaging learning experiences and to help students become more effective learners. So I'd like to welcome Michelle and also thank her for waking up a lot earlier than the rest of us, being in Arizona, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction. Most appreciated. And my first order of business will be to share my screen. So here we go. And there we go. We've got a good view of those now. So I thank all of you for being here today. I know that it's so much goes into organizing an event like this, and it happens through the hard work of so many people. So I want to thank everyone. And I'm so glad that we can be here today, even though we can't be physically present in the same room. So we are here today to talk about some of the core processes that underlie learning and to explore the interconnections between those, and especially what happens when technology is in the mix. And we're going to bring all that home too, to some concrete things that we can all do to keep students progressing, even in new formats and with completely new challenges. And so as you heard from that introduction, I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. And although these days my work mostly focuses on applications, practical applications of discoveries from that field, that's what fundamentally shapes my take on teaching and learning. And you'll hear that today. And I think that this really is the time to be talking about teaching and learning in higher education. There's still so much uncertainty and so much upheaval in what we do as teachers, and many of us are looking to make some changes. So in this talk, I hope to seed some principles that we can use to teach powerfully and effectively, and regardless of the modality or combination of modalities that we're going to be using. And so I'm going to be presenting examples that work pretty well online, remote synchronous, and even in more traditional face-to-face teaching environments. So I really believe that there is no better time to be talking about teaching, especially teaching that leverages the great research that we have on how human beings learn and leverages the great technology we have today as well. And I also believe that when we have principles and frameworks that can guide us in the design of learning experiences, that simplifies a lot of our choices as well. So that's what can help us winnow down from the almost infinite number of choices about how to approach teaching in different formats into a reasonable number that map onto the most important goals that we have as teachers. So that is the big picture of what we'll be addressing today. Now, I want to share with you as well a resource that I've prepared for you that don't feel that you have to click over to this right now. It's not that kind of thing where we're going to use it actively during the session. However, I am a fanatic for providing supporting data, backing research, and so forth for all the claims that we make about teaching and learning. So that's what's contained and collected on this site, which you can visit anytime. And I hope you will visit it after the talk is over today. And you'll also find other ideas for application and other details that are just hard to work into a 1-hour talk. So that's provided for you, and I hope that that will also be productive for you to check out. Okay, so a little bit more about our goals for today and how we're going to be spending our time, what we're going to be addressing today. So when I look to break down our topic for today, I came to these kind of 4 guiding questions about these. So first of all, that kind of what I keep coming back to in all of my research and writing and work I do with faculty, what are the cognitive processes that underlie learning? And what does that tell us about teaching and learning? And then today, we'll also be looking at some really important interconnections between those cognitive processes and processes that we know about from some other aspects of human psychology, in particular, motivation and self-regulated learning, and looking at how we can leverage those principles in our teaching, especially in making those technology choices that are both motivating and tap into cognitive principles, and especially in the widened array of formats in which we're teaching today, online, remote, and hybrid style. So that's kind of how our concepts break down today. And we will have opportunities to interact. This is a large and vibrant group, which I think is wonderful. But we'll have different stop out points that I've built into our more formal presentation this morning, where we can use Q&A and be recognized and talk about our reactions to some of what I'll be presenting today. And then I definitely encourage everybody to attend the full Q&A session that we have scheduled for later this afternoon. So I'm hoping that we'll really raise some more in-depth questions that we can explore in the Q&A session. Okay, so that's sort of the very big picture, big introduction. It's a lot. So what I would like for us to actually stop at and do right now is a demonstration of a very important principle and perhaps set of principles that we're going to be coming back to throughout our talk today. So if you'll indulge me, here is a quick activity that I'll invite you to try. Now, this is something that involves your memory. So we're going to be referencing something that will be, all of you have encountered before, a few of you are experts on, but most of us are not experts on. So I would like to try this. So, as you probably have seen many times before, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? So this is just an example we're going to start with today. First Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees 5 specific freedoms, all right? So we've encountered the First Amendment many times, all right? What I would like for you to try to do right now, without referencing any sources, so no cell phones, no Googles allowed for at least the first initial part of this exercise, I would like for you to consider whether you can list all 5 of those. In any order, we're not going to worry about the wording or the technicalities of the ins and outs, just in general, all 5 of those completely. And I think it's unlikely, unlike in a face-to-face environment where we'd all be whispering to each other, I don't think that we're going to be doing that, but just in case, this is a individual keep it to yourself type of exercise, all right? So I want you to get that kind of firmly fixed in mind. Are you able to remember all 5 of those? All right. And now I want you to reflect for just a second on how well you think you did, okay? So you'll know right away if you've got 5. You may not know if they're correct, but you probably know if you're missing 1 or more of them, okay? So reflect for a minute on kind of your mental and cognitive state right now as you think about that if you didn't get all 5 of them, all right? And now and only now, let's think about what the right answers are. So now you can go to town with the cell phone if you like, look them up and see how you performed. Okay, so if you didn't get all 5, that's fine. Don't worry about it. I actually saw a survey recently that only 2% of United States adults were able to name all 5. For most of us, it's something that we have to actively really think about and then probably check our work if we didn't get them all right. And this actually reflects on some pretty profound things about how memory works, and especially the kind of memory that's involved in the teaching and learning that we do. So we've got a little Q&A opportunity here right off the top to post and be recognized. about what happened when you attempted to retrieve this. Did it in particular seem to create some kind of a receptive window? And what do you think this tells us about memory in general? How is it possible that you've seen and probably thought about this important aspect of our laws and Constitution many times, and yet, if you're like most people, you couldn't remember them? So you've seen them many times, you probably couldn't remember them when you're put on the spot. And then what happened when you did try to actively retrieve them? So that's a big reflection question, but let's jump in. Remember, there's not really any wrong answers here. What comments and reflections do you have about these? All right. So if you tried this exercise, didn't get them all right, what does this tell us about memory? So it's time to jump into the Q&A and perhaps be recognized by our co-facilitators, co-moderators, if you'd like to jump in with an opinion about what it was like to try this exercise and what it might tell us about. Okay, so we have in the Q&A, we've got, if you don't mind my kind of paraphrasing and reading out here. Okay, my American government teaching in high school, I only came up with 4. That's really, really typical. I think probably what gets most people is the right to petition for redress of grievances. That's the one that kind of eludes us. Her disapproving stare will haunt me tonight. Well, you're very welcome for that. Easier to remember the concepts that you understood. Okay, all right. Yeah, so perhaps it's some of the more complex ones that even though we've seen them, they escape us. Very good. All right. And these are the kind of opening exercises that I like to do with my students when we start talking about some principles of why we take in what we do and why we forget other things, and especially the impact of actively trying to retrieve some piece of information, which is rather surprising and ties into one of the biggest discoveries that we've made about how to accelerate learning in the last several decades. Yes. Don't you explore the connections between them? Right. So what ties them all together? So if it's a list of 5 disjointed, unrelated things, that's going to be a lot less memorable than if they all come together under some principles. Right. So relatively simple exercises like this one can really crack open a whole array of facets of why we remember what we remember and why we forget what we forget. Okay, so we will come back to this. This will make a reappearance later on today. So keep that in mind. All right, so even though we've seen something many times, we may forget it. All right, so let's head over now to these cognitive principles that I want to frame for you today. So when we talk about cognitive principles that are involved in learning, what does that mean for us? Okay, so as I've worked with faculty, as I've written and done research on how to leverage cognitive science in teaching, what I've found to be the most useful is this 3-part breakdown of the cognitive processes that are most relevant to teaching and learning. So I find this a really useful framework to break down and get our arms around what is a pretty big and complex field. So I'll give you an overview, kind of a really compressed summary of some of the highlights here. So these facets of cognition that are so important for teaching and learning, they start with attention, all right? And, you know, when I sat down to write Minds Online, I, of course, went out and looked at the other classic books that have been written in this area, and I was really surprised that so few of them specifically referenced attention. And as a cognitive psychologist, I say this is surprising because we know from decades of research now that very little really happens in these interesting conscious parts of cognition without attention kind of being first on the scene, all right? So in particular, there's a really powerful connection to memory. So things that we don't pay focused attention to, we're very, very unlikely to remember. I mean, you can make a few exceptions around the margins, but in general, this is true. So I really think that it's a good idea for us as teachers to be thinking first about capturing students' focus, right? Because if students aren't focused and aren't paying attention, it's unlikely that they're going to retain very much. All right, so thinking about where attention is going during learning and how we're capturing that focus. And then this second facet, memory. Now, we want to be really, really careful here and say, even though there's a big focus in today's talk on memory as an example, that does not mean that memory or memorization is the most important end-all be-all of learning. So I don't believe that. Nobody I know who's serious about teaching and learning really believes that. That said, this is one important aspect of the learning that we want our students to do. We want them to acquire a body of knowledge, hopefully a very richly interconnected, deeply ingrained body of knowledge as part of what they're learning in higher education. So I think it's fine to have some focus on this. And this is true even in a technological age when you can go run and Google pretty much anything. We still need and want our students to have some things down cold. We really do. And furthermore, today's research is really challenging the idea that memory and acquiring knowledge is somehow in opposition to developing thinking skills, right? So everybody I know who is serious about teaching and learning wants students to develop thinking skills as a major, major aim of what we're doing in the classroom. However, we do know that there's some interesting suggestions now that the more students know about an area and the more solidified that knowledge is, the more they're able to think like experts in this field. So these two things can be complementary. They don't have to work in opposition to each other. And so it's also really great that we have a lot of research today that shows how we can help students acquire more knowledge more quickly than ever before. All right, so memory, one important aim of what we're doing, and something where the discoveries of cognitive psychology are incredibly relevant. And those thinking skills, right? So we do want this the most of all as an outcome of our teaching. I believe that. I know when I sit down with my introduction to psychology students, for example, I want them to know a lot about all the great discoveries of our field and have the right terminology, but ultimately at the end of the day, what I really want more than anything is for them to think more like psychologists. I want them to think a little bit more like I do about common problems that involve human psychology. That's what I really want. But, really wanting something isn't enough to assure it. And this is what we run into in the teaching of thinking skills. So in the teaching of thinking and how we develop skills for teaching, this one big dichotomy comes out that while learning that content knowledge about an area is helpful, it certainly doesn't assure that students are going to begin thinking more like experts. So learning about all the great psychology research that's out there and how other people have set up their experiments helps, but it doesn't assure that my students can approach problems in the way that a psychologist would, or that they can do that consistently over time and across situations. So for this, students need a lot of substantive practice, almost more practice than we ever typically build into a course. So however much we have, we can usually use more opportunities for students to practice substantive thinking skills. So this is, as I said, one, I think, really powerful framework for stepping back and revisiting what we're doing and why we're doing it in the design of learning experiences. So capturing focus, supporting memory, giving students the practice at developing thinking skills. Okay, so in a sense, this is, the gears turning. It's the mechanisms of cognition that has really been the focus here. And I think that there's a lot we can take from this. But that said, as I really got into this work, as I started writing Minds Online and started exploring how we can use these research findings effectively, I realized that there really is something missing, and that is motivation. All right, so the motivation to actually complete these learning activities that we've set up according to these wonderful empirical principles. And I say I realized something was missing. I mean this very literally. As I was getting about 3/4 of the way through Minds Online, I realized that my plan for the book was not going to work out the way I had originally planned it. And I had to really refocus and have heart to heart with the editor and all this stuff to say, I don't think that you can really fully separate the cognitive side of learning from motivation, especially eliciting the productive effort from students that I think is the basis for pretty much all learning. So these things are very richly interconnected, and those are the connections that we're going to try to weave together in the rest of our time here today. So bringing together the cognitive and the motivational sides of learning. What does that look like when it's happening, and how can we promote that? So it also gets into this concept of self-regulated learning. So even if you haven't run across this concept much before, that's probably a pretty appealing term just on the face of it. I know it is for me. So there's different ways of defining this, of course, and I've presented for you one of my favorites from Linda Nilsson, who's written a series of incredibly practical books, including a whole one on creating self-regulated learners. And in Nilsson's definition, we kind of see this picture emerging of a student who takes charge of this learning process, right? Who's able to plan very consciously, planning ahead of time, monitoring, so saying very honestly, okay, how am I doing? Is what I'm doing working? Do I need to do something else? Self-evaluating, reflecting, and being able to really be in charge of and control the learning process, okay? So when we talk about students who are motivated, I think that this is oftentimes what we really mean as teachers is we want students to be self-regulated, all right? They need to be the ones who are providing some of this fuel for the learning process and being able to be in charge of that. So to me, there's a lot involved here. There's knowledge, there's a disposition, there's wanting to put in the effort and being willing to do that. So yeah, self-regulated learning, powerful concept that comes up when we talk about motivation among students. Now here's a question that I'm going to pose to you, and I'm going to make a claim here. I'm going to make the claim that self-regulation and motivation are more important in higher education than they ever have been before. And I would say that before the pandemic hit, and I would say it now. So this is a claim. It's a big claim. You may or may not agree with this, but I want us to give an opportunity. If you agree, perhaps if you disagree, let us know about that as well. But to reflect on, okay, why might that be the case? Why is it possible that self-regulation and motivation among students is more important than ever before? So I'm going to open us up for some comments, Q&A. What is your take on this issue? So why is motivation more important, self-regulation more important than ever before? If you agree, why might that be? I'm going to check out the Q&A here for our views on this question. And I'll put the claim itself. Seems there are more distractions. Okay. All right. Yes, that's an issue definitely close to my heart. Right. So there's simply more that pulls us away. And I think not just for our students, but for all of us. But right, we're in this environment. Too many distractions our students are facing in general. Right. So we have other, perhaps more complex demands. We've got so much time alone. Okay. Right. We're social creatures, and we can be very motivated by what everybody around us is doing. And for many of us, we don't have that in the same way anymore. Okay. Easy to procrastinate, feel overwhelmed and distracted. Right. So things like procrastination, overwhelm, these can combine into a particularly toxic brew in today's educational environment. Okay. Many demands on our time. Oh, good. So more of these coming up. Okay. Particularly in the case of asynchronous instruction, we've got a good point here about students needing to be responsible for their own structure in terms of schedule. And I think this is a great springboard for, yeah, nailing down some of the possible factors here. So absolutely, consider that in a traditional face-to-face course, students need a lot of motivation to really get everything out of that. But they do have a familiar routine of here's where we meet, here's when we meet, usually twice a week or so. If nothing else, you're going to be physically present. Here's this teacher who's going to be looking at you and saying, oh, well, did you do the homework? Why not? And here's what we're all going to do today. So again, that collective kind of social, highly motivating environment. So at least we've got that to start with. It doesn't assure success, but it is a great starting point for students. And in other environments, they may not have that. So I want to imply here that on things like online learning or learning on your own or correspondence courses or anything like that, well-designed online courses do have a lot of structure to them. They have a lot of engagement to them, and there's lots of opportunities for students to be supported. However, those lines of support may not be as clear, and you do have this out of sight, out of mind problem with opening up an online course. They're very easy to get behind and then set off a real kind of cycle of procrastination. They're taking place in these more distracting environments. I mean, we've just sent students onto the internet to do an online course. It's the most intentionally distracting, engineered to pull you away from everything environment that there is. So that's challenging as well. Some courses may have self-pacing to them, which is wonderful. I think flexibility is absolutely incredibly important right now, especially. But for students who are prone to procrastination, that's going to present some challenges. So there is that very pragmatic set of factors that I think we're all thinking about right now. But I want to present to you that there is also this, right? This fact that we do know so much more about how learning works than we ever have before. And that's what I'm trying to symbolize here with this overstuffed set of library shelves. But all that research can be hard to implement if students are not meeting us there and putting in the effort, which is ultimately what they have to do. So, right, if we are going to have these evidence-based courses that leverage all this great science, this has to be in the mix. We have to be explicitly talking about, all right, so how are students stepping up to take advantage of these things, right? Now, at this point, I want us to explore one case in point that I think does illustrate, first of all, some of the challenges, but why it is that we have to talk about motivation at the same time we're talking about leveraging learning sciences and cognitive psychology. And this is in the area of retrieval practice. Okay, so retrieval practice, this is one of the biggest discoveries to come onto the scene ever in really practical applied cognitive psychology that we can use in classes, right? So retrieval practice, what is it? Retrieval practice is pretty much any time you are actively pulling something out of memory, right? So instead of looking at it or hearing it again, you're pulling it out of your own memory. All right, so that's retrieval practice. It's typically associated with tests and quizzes, but it definitely doesn't have to be. So when I asked you to kind of rack your brain for the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, that was retrieval practice. If I ask students to say, do a classic brain dump activity where I say, okay, close your books and write down everything you remember from last class period, then turn to your neighbor and see whether you got the same stuff. That is retrieval practice. If I have students playing a quiz game in class that doesn't maybe count towards their grade, but gives them feedback on how they're doing, that's retrieval practice. And retrieval practice produces the testing effect. So the testing effect, very simply, is that when we do this, it has a more powerful effect on our memory, positive effect, than basically anything else we could do at the time. Now, that's a big claim, but we can definitely back it up, all right? So if a student has 20 minutes to review, to try to solidify their knowledge and study in a class, they are going to get more out of that 20 minutes if they spend it quizzing themselves or taking a structured quiz of some kind than rereading, reviewing, or pretty much anything else that they could do. So just speaking of the memory, knowledge acquisition aspect of learning, This is big news. This is big stuff, right? So retrieval practice does improve memory across, and this holds up across a lot of materials and ways of doing quizzes. And that's the other really exciting thing. It's not just the magnitude of the impact, but the fact that this is so robust. It doesn't have to be a particular question format. It's not just the sort of thing that only lasts till the end of the psychology study where you're taking the measurements. It can hold up for months or more. And so this absolutely does apply in realistic situations with realistic academic materials. And I've given you here, you can also find this on the website. This is just one of many great reviews that pulls together all of that supporting research. So really solid stuff here. And of course, you knew that I'd probably bring it up at this point without referencing any sources. Can you recall all 5 of those? Okay. So if you ask yourself, like right now, you might see a concrete demonstration already of this testing effect, that you're probably already better. If you didn't get 100% before, you might be a lot closer right now because you were put on the spot to remember. It's not that there was a grade attached or anything, but you went through that mental process. And furthermore, here's the thing is we also now know that when you're engaged in a retrieval practice and you do get something wrong, it creates this sort of receptive window where restudying the material or reviewing it actually is very, very productive. So if you're just kind of passively looking over information about the Constitution, it's unlikely to stick. But if I ask you the question, you go, oh, I can't get that 4th or 5th one. Then you look again, bam, now it sticks in memory. So that's just yet another kind of positive aspect of these dynamics. And we can find other kinds of everyday examples of this too. Frequently, I ask my students to, at the opening of a class, beginning of the semester, to try to draw a penny on scratch paper. Even though we've seen it thousands of times, we know that most people cannot do that. And that opens a conversation about, yeah, passive review does very little for memory. But active retrieval practice, focusing on something, actually really, really does. And one last kind of everyday example of this in play that is very much on my mind these days is take the example of when we go online shopping, which I find myself doing very frequently these days. There's those credit card, those numbers on the back of your credit card, your little CVV code. It's just 3 numbers. You can remember it. However, I found that every time I was going online and pulling the trigger on that order, I was pulling out the card and looking at it. I saw it many, many times, but I was unable to ever really recall it. So what I asked myself to do was put the card away and challenge myself to see if I could input the numbers from memory. I was wrong a few times, but very, very quickly, I did learn those numbers. So this is something that's in play in a lot of different places. And we may have seen it in play today with this demonstration. And here's another kind of bonus set of findings that's coming up in more recent research since Minds Online came out, is we are finding that when students engage in more retrieval practice, that it does support the development of these thinking skills, right? So in this case, it's a little bit technical terms in the title of this one sample article I've put here, but long-term inference, basically the ability to pull something general out of a set of facts in an area, that's supported by retrieval practice. The ability to transfer knowledge to new areas, right? So, thinking skills have that now you see it, now you don't quality, where you learn it over here and we go to the next module and it's gone. A very stubborn problem in education. Well, one of the things that helps is when students actively, frequently quiz. So this is kind of a gift that keeps on giving in the psychology of teaching and learning. All right. Great. Wonderful. So we know that retrieval practice works. This is like this huge success story in evidence-based teaching in higher education. It really, really is. Awareness is spreading about this. More people know about it. There's even, I put this website address here, retrievalpractice.org. This effect has its own website, and it's wonderful, by the way. I would absolutely send you here at any point to get lots more concrete ideas for how to bring retrieval practice into the classroom. Lots of creative ways to do this. So that's wonderful. But what's the catch, right? The catch is that students have to actually do these wonderful retrieval practice opportunities that we set up for them, right? If we don't draw them into completing them, they may as well not exist. And here's an additional complication that really kind of arises to me as a psychologist thinking about how this all works. And it's this, that, so why don't students engage in more retrieval practice? Some of them don't know about it. Okay, it's never dawned on them that that might be really productive for learning to take additional quizzes or tests. But there's also the fact that these are more effortful. It is easier to do what is the go-to strategy for many students, which is to kind of reread and restudy. And lastly, you have to be willing to kind of accept that feedback as a learner. So remember, self-regulated learners are those who are pretty honest about what's working and what isn't. Okay, they're able to look at their own performance and say, kind of, in a detached way, here's what's working, here's what's not working. Well, that's one of the things that quizzes do, right? They expose for us what we do not know. And restudying in a passive way, we tend to gravitate towards the things that we feel more confident in. So you have to have that piece of it as well, a willingness to say, well, I'm going to take this quiz, even if it doesn't always tell me what I want to hear about my learning. And I have to be willing to go back and tackle those parts that I did not get. They were particularly challenging, right? So that's why I say that retrieval practice is an amazing case in point for how these things are interconnected, right? All right, so we're going to think about how to engage students in retrieval practice. This is where it gets kind of concrete. And I also want to pick up on a really neat question that's come in versus via the Q&A here. So we've been taught the importance of long-term memory versus short-term takes repetition and time to move from one to the other, and explaining why certain bits of information are immediately remembered for all time in one exposure. I love this question. This is like one of my favorite phenomena in human memory to talk about. So yes, and if you do ever try that draw a penny demonstration with your students, this is one of the things that will come up. If, this disconnect between it's not about just being exposed to something that makes you remember it. I would further kind of qualify that idea of moving from short-term to long-term, right? A lot of us were taught that in our early exposure to memory theory. And of course, memory theorists today go, hold up, it's not really, that's kind of a mechanistic way to think about the formation of memories. And furthermore, what we really mean by short-term, technically in a lab, short-term memory is really, we're talking about like a few seconds, not as we commonly think about it in everyday life of like, well, short-term is what happened to me today and long-term is what's going to be permanent. So there's some pieces to that too. So it really helps to kind of flip it around and say, well, why does your mind pick up on certain things and why does it forget others? Why do you forget all the details of a penny? Well, you're not focused. It's not important. You don't understand. Maybe you don't have a concept for how all those fit together. And so repetition of just looking at a penny is nothing is moving into long-term memory. So what happens when we do have that one time, I saw it one time and bam, I got it forever? Well, typically what's going on here is some combination of emotions. So the element of surprise is a big one. So especially when we talk about events in our lives that we remember forever, they're oftentimes surprising, important, personally relevant. So yeah, these are the sorts of things we need students to be bringing to bear here. So, and things that we understand. So here's another really good example, I think, is if you think about people who are like these experts in some area, like they're just an absolute sports fanatic, let's say. They can look at a fact about their preferred sport and boom, they've got it forever. And why is that? Well, it's because they can interpret it, bring it in and say, oh, well, that's a really neat reason. And that's why, and it reminds me of this other fact over here. And I understand the significance of it. You tell me something like that, I'm not into sports. And I kind of go, ooh, all right. It's in one ear, out the other. So yeah, these are the sorts of conditions that lead to information being really memorable. Can I use it now? Does it relate to me? Do I understand it? Is there some kind of emotion involved in it? Otherwise, yeah, it sort of like a conveyor belt and it falls off. Active learning, experiential learning, absolutely. So if we reflect and think back to our own educational experiences, that's where we get the memorable stuff. So thank you very much for kind of sparking that and giving me the opportunity to share some of those with you. So moving now to how we get students to engage in retrieval practice, but really this applies to other approaches that we know deliver. They deliver a big impact for time invested, but they take more effort on the part of the student. I think that there's quite a few things we do in teaching that fit under that umbrella. Hard, effortful, rewarding. So let's hear from some more folks in Q&A. What are some ideas that you've used or heard about for actually engaging students in either retrieval practice or other kinds of high effort, high impact things we want to do? So what are some other ideas for engaging students in these? What do we think? Prediction. Okay, very good, right? And that is a little bit of that flavor of, okay, I'm answering the question and what's the answer? What's the answer? What was that last 5 freedoms? Oh my gosh. So yeah, and this is involved in some classic techniques. If you're familiar with the peer instruction technique, Eric Mazur and colleagues came up with, where you have students actually have to take a stand on something. And I think it's easy to say, oh, that works for science classes, but not others. But why is that? I mean, we can say there's lots of questions students could weigh in on, see how their answer stacks up to others, and then really reflect on the reasoning that led to them. Okay, handwriting, not typing notes, and okay, that can be one as well. So if we want students to synthesize information into those meaningful frameworks, we can ask them to do that in a very deliberate way. Anything else that we would offer as a tool of the trade for getting students to actually put forth the effort to do these great learning activities we've set up? Anything else? All right. Well, feel free to keep those rolling along in the Q&A if so, because these are exactly the sorts of things that we need to be swapping right now, these tips. Okay, so getting really, really concrete. Time speed drills on small facts. Yes, especially if it's not, incredibly high stress situation with lots and lots of points. Warm-up exercises before class with material that they have not seen before. Okay, so getting again into that element of surprise and challenge and who got it right. And here's where the technologies really come in as well. So, retrieval practice, the testing effect, this has been known in one form or another for a very long time. However, it's not until recently that we were able to make it really practical with technology to do things like present really quick reading quizzes, auto-graded quizzes, or even have a gamified experience in class. Now, don't worry too much about the text here. These are kind of visual reminders or placeholders on the screen for some of the approaches. So Kahoot, if you have not heard of Kahoot, it does one thing. It does it really, really well, in my opinion. And it's really neat because, believe it or not, this runs very well remotely with a remote synchronous group, and then you can also use it with an asynchronous group. So Kahoot allows you to make these timed, short, friendly competition types of quizzes that students can take. And we do these about every week in most of my classes in one form or another. iClicker, so those student response systems are kind of being supplanted by smartphone apps, but that's still an option. Even something like Poll Everywhere, that's a great way to gather predictions, for example. And even using what's already in a learning management system to say, build a big database of quiz questions from the publisher or your own stuff, and then having students do those before the class meeting and setting it up in a way, incentivizing it in a way that it's repeatable. So where students are allowed and even encouraged to take, a random sampling of those quiz questions many times over. I like to set it up to where they just keep the highest grade. Why is that? Well, we want to make it so that students have a good reason to go back in, no risk, and keep trying the quiz questions. And when I talk about this to students, I'm saying, well, why on earth would I do that? Oh, well, it's because, remember, retrieval practice helps learning, and this is a quiz for learning. This is not a quiz to measure you or see how you stack up against everybody else. So those are some of the techniques that we can use. And so really we're talking here about structuring assessments for motivation. So we've already got assessments in our course. We've already got students doing assignments. What are some motivational principles that we can draw on? Well, here's the thing, is just how the points are structured and the timing of those assessments. So there are these really old, really well-established principles of motivation in psychology that say that, people are more likely to put forth effort, right? They behave in motivated ways when they can see the impact of anything they've done, all right? So if I do something and I get some feedback right away, that's helpful. And if that happens to me frequently, that builds this pattern where I keep wanting to come back to that. And, to take a kind of a cartoonish example, imagine with video games. I mean, who would play Fortnite if you had to do something, then wait 2 weeks and see if it did any good? Or every 6 weeks, you got a big amount of feedback on here's how your gameplay was. So we always advise in our initiatives this early and often principle. I even say, like, arbitrarily in the first 1 or 2 weeks of class, there should be something that students are doing for credit. And this also tends to really transform students' mentality from the beginning. So I've really personally seen this happen, that even when there's something very small, not many points, it's just maybe a pre-assessment or something like that to see what you know when you come in, students see right away, oh, well, things are expected of me in this class, and we get started early. And instead of turning students off, that really does draw them in. And it sets that tone right from the beginning that we want to elicit this from you. And whenever we can give that fast feedback to students, then that's also, it creates what we call self-efficacy. I tried something, I got something back. I tried something, I got something back. And you think about a more, kind of the more extreme end of that. If we were to just have, 2 midterms and a final, students going 4 weeks, 6 weeks without getting feedback in a course, one of the things that happens is that does become a fertile ground for procrastination, right? Working towards these very, very big goals that become overwhelming, and then it's easier to avoid. So while this is not the magic bullet for procrastination, styling your points and your assessments in the class in this way is helpful. Now, if I say points and say incentives and things like that, it does also raise this other issue, which is that, points are not the end all and be all of motivation. And I know there's a lot of different schools of thought in how to handle grades and grading, or whether we should even be grading at all. So you may also be thinking of this term intrinsic motivation, right? So aren't we talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? And here's the thing is that is a good solid concept in teaching and learning, right? That there's, first of all, extrinsic motivation is I'm doing it for points, I'm doing it for a reward, I'm doing it for a paycheck. Intrinsic is, hey, I want to see if I can achieve in this area. I'm really interested in this area. And, while the classical research kind of pitted one against the other, said we want intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic, these days we really do see it in a more nuanced way, right? So I think it's good for us to not see those as mutually exclusive. Both of these things can coexist in a course. So we can build intrinsic motivation. And here's the other thing that I see as kind of a little bit of a trap we can fall into if we're exclusively relying on intrinsic motivation, is that it's easy to just set this all up as a question of interest, right? So saying, well, students are going to do well in my statistics class if they're interested in statistics, or they're going to do well in my cognitive psychology class if they think that this is interesting. And, pre-existing interest is not necessary to have a very motivating class. And I think we can all realize this if we think back to our own education and say, there probably were classes that we took because they were required or because the time fit our schedule. We walked in, we said, I don't know what this is about. But something about that class got us interested and got us interested in investing effort. And there's also the fact that, we might not be interested in, say, statistics, but we're interested in what a degree in psychology will allow us to do later. And so that's fine too. And so with intrinsic motivation, I think we can also think about kind of breaking that down. How do we kind of start to build that day to day? And it does start with emotion. So this is where stuff like surprise, curiosity, feeling accepted in a classroom community, these things can start to lay the foundation for that. So how do you get students invested in the content they are retrieving? I'm reading a new question off of Q&A. What other goals need to be built in other than successful retrieval and, say, an exam? What is the value beyond the classroom to motivate students? Well, actually, this segues really nicely into another kind of set of issues in drawing students into the harder, more challenging things that we're asking them to do. So retrieval practice, a gamified, let's all see what we know, that's a great start. But what else can we do to have students say, well, what's the importance of this information to begin with? So here's where I think it's good to think about that side of practice. So kind of circling back to, remember that students are going to need practice. If they want to think like a psychologist, they got to have practice, doing this, and how we can set those conditions. Now, one kind of body of techniques that we can use, that can use technology or not, are things like case studies and scenarios. So students can be pretty motivated when we give them a hypothetical situation and ask them to project themselves into that, right? I'll share one example from a long time ago when we were redesigning our Introduction to Psychology course. We realized that we wanted students to be able to apply this stuff in everyday situations, but we didn't have anything that actually asked them to do that. So there was exercises such as saying, okay, imagine that you have a really badly behaved new puppy and it's destroyed the living room furniture and your roommates say you have to get rid of the puppy. Okay, write an email to your roommates using concepts from the learning chapter that we just did on behavior, reinforcement and what have you. Use that to craft this email to your roommates. And students will really get into something like that when it's framed that way. Giving students problems that they're not quite ready to master. So for example, another example that we did last week in my Introduction to Psych class, I started on the first day, instead of going over the syllabus, what we did was I showed them a really short video clip of a very new agey kind of concept about manifesting, your perfect life or whatever. And we looked at that, and then I asked them, okay, do you find this plausible? And now we're going to think about how to design a study to test some of these claims that were in this video. It's a little risky because you don't want, I'm going, oh my gosh, my students are going to go, oh, all these claims are right, but that's not what they did. And even though they weren't coming up with, perfect disciplinary appropriate examples, they were trying. They were jumping in and saying, well, what if I had to study this tomorrow? How would I do it? So these are some ideas. And furthermore, with technology choices, we can also look for technologies that are very specifically geared to practicing particular thinking skills. So I'll just, these are just little, again, visual placeholders. Don't worry too much about the text. But out there, when you look within particular disciplines, there are sometimes programs and apps already developed that isolate and address certain aspects of what students need to be able to do at the end of the day. So the famous Sniffy, the rat program in psychology, that's a way to further teach students about principles of reinforcement and what have you, using a simulated rat that you can give little rewards to and see what happens to his behavior. That's a lot more effective than just having them read and reread the different chapters. In physics and biochemistry, we have this wonderful project, the Interactive Simulations project from UC Boulder, so where students can actually manipulate and interact with different simulations of different concepts in these fields. So that's something that we can go out and begin to select as the experts. And it's not about the technology per se. It's not about, let's drop some kind of a product in here to do the work. It's about finding products that let students engage in those thinking skills that we want them to have and give them lots of opportunities for practice. So those are some ideas. Now, I'll just wind up here with, I think that something that we could all be doing a little bit differently, and something that we can all try to do, is more consciously and deliberately build those self-regulation skills across the disciplines, right? So instead of just saying, well, students aren't motivated, they don't know how attention works, they don't know to put their phones away during class. Well, okay, let's address that. And so we can teach our students, no matter what our specialization is, we can share things like retrieval practice with them, right? So once students have that opportunity, they see it in action, they may, be able to apply that as self-regulated learners. And one of my favorites, teaching students about attention and distraction very, very deliberately. And in fact, we have this project, it's also referenced pretty heavily in the website I gave you, the Attention Matters Project. We actually built a 1 or 2 hour kind of module that students can earn extra credit in different classes for doing. And this is what it engages students in. It's not just reams of text to read, it's things like demonstrations, short videos they can watch, discussions that really aim at two things. Number one, that quizzing and active engagement is a lot more effective for memory than rereading. And number two, that your attention is more limited than you realize. And when you're not paying attention, you're not learning. So we have seen that students' attitudes and beliefs and knowledge about attention and memory are really significantly changed just by a short module that they can take. So those are some kind of concrete ways we can go about this. And it's something everybody can put their disciplinary stamp on as they engage their students. And, lastly, there's this principle as well, and this is very, very encouraging. We're seeing it in this study I'm showing you, and there's some others as well that aim at this one thing, that when students see these in action, when they take a course that has a daily quiz and asks them to reflect on their learning and all that good stuff, that they adopt that and they take it to the next class. If they've seen it and it works, they may do it on their own. And this addresses, I think, sometimes we hear a concern that, well, if I'm, encouraging students to quiz and study actively, won't that kind of do the work for them? Will we kind of kill them with kindness? And it looks like that's not the dynamic that happens, that when students see this successfully deployed in a class, they go, okay, yeah, spontaneously, a week later, maybe even a semester later, there's no quizzes in this class. Well, I'm going to come up with some because I know that that works, right? So that's a wonderful way that we can tie together the cognitive and the motivational sides of learning, right? Giving students the opportunity to see these, putting them in engaging, motivating environments, and then setting things up to take advantage of principles like retrieval practice. So we are at the end of our hour today, and I think it's very important to be kind of formulating in our minds, what are we going to take from today that we can apply next week? So what are some of the next steps? And I do want to open it up one more time for, we only have a few minutes left, but any thoughts right now? And I'm definitely hoping we have a lively discussion. I believe it's in a few hours your time about some of these principles. So what else would you like to post in the chat? Are these resources available for use? The Attention Matters module is, most of it is Creative Commons. We have a whole kind of Dropbox folder set up with the materials. You're welcome to kind of unbundle them and use them however you like. It's not a real, a slick commercial product where you can just, open it up in your learning management system, but we've been very interested in making those available. So yeah, available on request for sure. Okay. All right. Very good. So I thank you so much for engaging today, and I hope we have seeded some principles, ideas, and techniques that we can all use to bring more learning to more students under different circumstances than we ever have before. So thank you very much.